To tell you a little bit more about myself, my work is at the intersection of urban and development economics. I'm currently on the market, and today I'm glad to present my job market paper, which deals with the interaction between informal employment and rural urban migration in low and middle income countries. So the initial motivation for this project is the following. As you may know, the global urban population is set to double by 2050. Those are recent figures from the World Bank. And this trend is mostly led by low and middle income countries in sub-Saharan Africa and the East Asia Pacific region. There, rural urban migration plays the main role as the urbanization factor compared to, let's say, the differential demographic trends across urban and rural areas. And more often than not, job opportunities act as the primary migration motive. At the same time, unregistered jobs make up a substantial share of employment in those countries. And typically, in terms of welfare, because those jobs pay less, are less stable, and do not come with welfare benefits, they are seen as a net loss from the government's point of view. Also, in terms of total output, because informal firms tend to be smaller, less productive, and do not pay taxes, it's also seen as an overall negative effect from the government point of view, which is taken as a common justification for formalization policies that are common in such context. However, in this paper, I argue that the picture is not so clear-cut because there's a substantial overlap in formal and informal activities. By that, I mean that the same workers are going to transition to and from formal and informal jobs, either or not transitioning through unemployment phases, and the same types of firms operating in the same industries at similar productivity levels are going to be found in both sectors as well. What this means is that, well, informal jobs, depending on the dynamic gains they offer to workers, may be seen either as a trap or as a stepping stone. Maybe for unemployed workers, it's easier to find an informal than informal job, and maybe when working informally, it becomes still easier for them to find a formal job in the future than it would have been if they have stayed unemployed. And maybe also on the firm side, it's possible that some of those firms are so low productivity that they would not be able to survive taxes and competition in the formal sector. So whether or not operating informally is a survival or an avoidance strategy for firms is something that remains to be seen in equilibrium. In this paper, I answer those two questions, which allow me to study the mechanisms to answer a third question, which is my main contribution in this paper. Do urban formalization policies also have spillover effects in space? My answer will be that it's indeed the case and that it has important consequences for welfare and output. The way I'm going to answer this question is the following. I'm designing a general equilibrium model of frictional labor mobility. And the key novelty of this model is that it features both migration choice and formal-informal occupational choice across sectors for workers. Then I estimate this model with a long South African panel survey of workers. This is going to allow me to assess the dynamic gains from informality and whether or not informality can be seen as a stepping stone or a trap from the worker's perspective. And then I'm going to simulate counterfactuals, and my main counterfactuals is going to consist in progressively increasing up to tripling, actually, the mean cost of being inspected and or fined for unbanned informal firms. And this is going to allow me to assess the job formalization versus job destruction rate on the firm's part, but also to assess the spatial reallocation of workers from the policy. And this will, in turn, give me the answer to questions 2 and 3 that are underlined in the slide before. Overall, this is going to allow me to assess the impact of informality on labor misallocation more generally. To give you a brief preview of results, for question 1, I find that in my context, urban informality can indeed be seen as a stepping stone for workers. The reason why is first because I find higher local job arrival rates for the urban informal than for the urban unemployed. And if you have to remember one figure for this question, Remember that the option value of future jobs in the formal sector accounts for 20% of the current discounted welfare value I find for urban informal workers. For question 2, I find that urban informality is mostly an avoidance strategy for firms because following the policy shock, I find a formalization rate that clearly dominates the job destruction rates. And finally, I find that the formalization shock makes cities less attractive. And the reason why is that because urban wages are going to fall due to firms' labor market power. I will come back on this mechanism when I present the results. The bottom line is that the urban population share is going to fall by 4% in equilibrium, which is non-negligible because it corresponds to globally roughly 3 years of urban growth at current rates. And in terms of development outcomes, the end result is going to be that output will rise at the cost of lower workers' welfare. However, special reallocation is going to limit at the same time the rise in output and the fall in welfare, and we're going to see how it works in a moment. I will skip the literature review in the interest of time. Do you have any questions on introduction before I keep on going? All right. So now for the data and stylized facts. Before all, I want to talk a bit more about the external validity of South Africa as a case study. Compared to most developing countries studied in the informality literature, South Africa features a relatively high unemployment rate and a relatively low informality rate. As you can see, low informality rate still accounts for 20% of the labor force, which is definitely one order of magnitude above what you would find in high-income countries. And South Africa also features a relatively high urban population share. What this means is that in terms of levels, South Africa is comparable to emerging economies such as Turkey. But what you have to keep in mind is that because of the relatively recent end of apartheid, urbanization trends are still very strong in South Africa. In terms of trends, the country is actually closer to what you would observe in typical low and middle income countries in Sub-Saharan Africa and the East Asia Pacific region. More specifically, the data that I'm going to use is called the National Income Dynamics Study. It's a nationally representative panel survey of South African workers. And more specifically, it surveys roughly 28,000 individuals interviewed in 5 waves over the 2008-2017 period. And importantly, the data yields employment information in between waves, which allows me to consider yearly periods in the model. Also, one specificity of this data set is that it allows me to follow individuals when they change locations, which labor force surveys typically do not allow you to do, and also to identify informal employment in a relatively objective way that limits the risk of self-reporting bias. In the data, I define informal workers as being either wage workers without a written contracts and without welfare benefits, either self-employed workers not registered to income tax or VAT, or individuals declaring to work on a casual basis. With that in mind, I also select my sample to have the most homogeneous benchmark sample possible by selecting low-skilled working-age adult males. By low-skilled, I mean adults without a high school certification, because I want to abstract from geographic sorting with respect to skills, typically. And also, this segment of the population is going to be the most affected by informal employment. I'm focusing on the working age range because my focus in this paper will be on labor-related mobility. On adults more specifically because I want to consider independent agents. And males for several reasons. First of all, it's been shown, especially in low and middle income countries, that labor market frictions and preferences substantially vary by gender. And more often than not in my context, males are declared as the household heads in the sample. And because I want to abstract from the joint decision problem in a couple, I focus on males as my benchmark sample. I leave alternative sample selections for future extensions. This leaves me with a benchmark sample of 3,500 individuals with an average interview success rate of 75%. What it means is that by pulling all observations together, I have roughly a 25% rate of attrition. The reason why I'm putting all observations together is that attrition is not an absorbing state in my data. It often happens that I lose individuals that I recover in later periods. And importantly, I know the reason why those individuals are not tracked in given waves. In 1/3 of the cases, it's due to an untracked geographic move. What I should say is that even though I do not specifically observe whether or not, the actual census block group in which individuals live, I know whether or not, I know the district in which they live and whether or not they're classified as urban or rural. And the number of observations that I lose due to untracked geographic moves is smaller than the number of geographic moves that are well tracked, actually. That's the reason why I impute those missing values by assuming that individuals stay at the same place when they are not observed. Finally, and this is important for the homogeneity assumption that will come in the model, this segment of the workforce is very substitutable and features low returns to experience. It means that in more than 90% of the cases, job transitions corresponds to changes in industries. And when individuals do not change jobs, their wage grows at a really slow rate. And this will allow me to keep a tractable model structure. To give you a more precise idea of the geography in the data, so as I said, I do not know precisely in which census block group people live, but I know whether or not this census block group was classified as rural or urban in the 2011 national census. Importantly, I collapse the so-called inactive and unemployed into one unemployment category. This is because the transitions from employment and so-called inactivity are frequent. And also, I only distinguish between formal and informal jobs in urban areas because I will focus on formalization policies in urban areas more specifically, and this is to lighten the burden of estimation. I will discuss potential unobserved heterogeneity concerns when presenting the moments that I use in the model. You see that compared to the macro figures that I gave in the introduction, my selected sample happens to be more rural, more unemployed, and more informal. And that's essentially because I focus on the low-skilled segment of the population. Here is the first set of moments I will target in the data. The picture I showed you before gave you an idea of the stocks that you observed, but gave you no ideas about the flows. What's the probability, depending on your state at period t, of transitioning to another state at period t+1? And this is exactly what I'm going to show in this transition matrix. For a brief reminder of the abbreviations that I will use here, R is going to stand for rural, U is going to stand for urban, N is going to stand for non-employed, and E is going to stand for employed. I further distinguish between formal and informal jobs within cities, which is the reason why you see those UF and UI instead of UE as a category. And also I add on the job search, OTGIS as an additional category, because it's possible that when you stay in the same geo-employment state, either you keep the same job, either you find a new job. And that I identify in the data by employment spells that are shorter than the time lag between two interview dates. This will correspond to a Markov process of order 1. And as I mentioned before, the figures I'm going to show are robust to heterogeneity checks. Typically, I do not show them here, but I computed the same transition matrix as the outcome of a multinomial logit model where I control for individual characteristics. Also by splitting the sample across formal and informal jobs in cities. Also by splitting the sample across wage jobs and self-employed jobs in the informal sector. And those all give me similar transition matrices. Let's start with the diagonal. So as you may expect, the most likely outcome when you're in a given state at period t is to stay in the same state, which is the reason why probabilities here, just for you, just to be clear, probabilities, raw probabilities are going to sum up to 1. Here you see that the probabilities are very large on the diagonal. Then there are some probabilities that you find a job locally either of the job when you're unemployed or on the job when you are employed. And this can happen within and across sectors. So typically, you see that informal workers are going to search both across the informal sector, which is going to be shown as on-the-job search, and within the formal sector. And importantly here, you see that the probability to transition from informal to formal jobs is not negligible compared to other on-the-job search probabilities. And this already points to the potential stepping stone, the stepping stone potential of informal jobs. There's also a probability that your job gets destroyed. And here you see that those probabilities are substantial and that they are also larger for informal than for formal jobs, which corresponds to the idea I gave in the introduction that those jobs tend to be less stable. And there's also some probability that you migrate from rural to urban areas into urban jobs, be them formal and informal. Those probabilities compared to the other ones may appear to be rather small, but what you have to keep in mind is that migrations are relatively rare phenomena compared to finding a job locally. And those figures are actually one order of magnitude above what you would typically find in Europe, for instance. Also, you notice that informal jobs are not necessarily less frictional than formal jobs. I mean, at least at this level, formal and informal jobs in cities for rural migrants have similar transition probabilities. Still, there is a higher propensity of urban informality among rural migrants than rural stayers. And finally, there's a last set of transitions that I will not account for in the model, and this is for several reasons. First of all, I will not account for urban to rural migration. First of all, because I will be focusing on rural exodus, which is 3 times more likely. When you're adding up all the transition probabilities, it's 3 times more likely to migrate from rural areas than the other way around. And also, I will not model, migration from rural into urban non-employment. And that's for 2 reasons, actually. First, because I will focus on job-related moves, and also because this, which are twice more likely, and also because this is going to be imposed by the spatial equilibrium condition, stating that in equilibrium, unemployed workers in rural areas cannot be worse off than what they would be if they were to migrate into non-employment in the city. Otherwise, all the rural unemployed would migrate into the city, which is not borne out in the data. So this is a limitation that's typically faced by job search models. And the way it's usually dealt with is by adding idiosyncratic preference shocks, which I will not have in the model because I will focus on homogeneous workers. Okay, so the second set of moments I will target in the model, which is also robust to heterogeneity checks, is the pooled cross-sectional wage distributions. So what I do to make wages comparable across time periods, I detrend them and deflate them to wage levels at similar time periods. And then I plot the distributions that I find considering all observations as being independent. And here you see that I find urban formal wages that dominate rural wages generally, that themselves tend to dominate urban informal wages. Importantly, there's a substantial overlap between those distributions, and that corresponds to the idea I gave in the introduction that you have a substantial overlap between formal and informal activities, and also that the rural-urban migration choice is not an obvious choice. I will skip through my 4th stylized facts, which looks at more precisely the observational returns to migration through fixed effect migrations to quantify the potential amount of bias in the model due to unobserved heterogeneity. I mean, I can go back to this if you have questions towards the end of the presentation. And I will now go through the model if what I presented is clear for now. Okay. So my model is going to be a dynamic and stationary spatial job search and matching model, which is going to feature 2 local labor markets and 3 employment states. More specifically, workers are going to be homogeneous and receive job offers at Poisson rates, which is the continuous time equivalent of the discrete Markov process I described with my transition matrix. They're going to search for jobs randomly on and off the job, locally and remotely. Importantly, they're going to benefit from relative amenities when being rural. The reason being that amenities will be recovered as residuals in the model, so that I fix urban amenities as being equal to 0, and the amenities that will be recovered in rural areas will be relative to this urban baseline. And typically, it will stand for how much individuals value rural characteristics, such as, let's say, low housing prices or more closely knit social networks, compared to urban amenities such as better local public services, etc. Also, workers are going to benefit from value of leisure when being non-employed. This corresponds to the idea of a reservation wage. And importantly, they're going to move from rural to urban areas upon accepting an offer and paying a fixed mobility cost. The difference between formal and informal jobs is that formal workers are going to benefit from unemployment insurance and severance payment when getting fired. That will be paid as a lump sum transfer. This is without loss of generality, because I will also assume risk-neutral agents, so that the lump sum assumption is innocuous. Of course, there's a potential insurance value of formal jobs versus informal jobs and urban jobs versus rural jobs that could be calibrated for, but that for now is lost in the model. And also, but those are more innocuous assumptions. I assume infinitely lived agents, and I assume that they inelastically supply 1 unit of labor. And indeed, I observe in the data that the number of hours worked does not vary substantially across job types. To give you a more precise idea of how this works, I will present the Bellman equations on the worker side, which which capture the optimality condition of the workers. On the left-hand side of the equation, you're going to find a lifetime utility value in location I, unemployment state K, discounted at rate R. That is going to be equal to a flow value, that is the current value you earn in your current state, and an option value, that is the expected differential that you will get from between your current value and future values of job opportunities. Your flow value will be made of the relative rural amenity term when you're rural, plus a value of leisure term if you're unemployed, or your current wage when you are employed. And those are all endogenous quantities in the model. The option value will be made up of several components. First of all, if you are employed, you may lose your job at job destruction rate delta. And this gives you no choice, basically, so that the option value that you would get is just the difference between the value of local non-employment and your current welfare value. Additionally, if you are a formal worker in cities, you may benefit from the income replacement rate from unemployment insurance plus the severance pay rate times your current wage that will be paid as a lump sum transfer, as I mentioned in the previous slide. Plus, if you are unemployed, you may look for jobs locally, and in which case you will accept any job offers you are made, because you're always going to end up better off than staying unemployed. And the option value that you will get is the differential between your current value and the expected value of job offers in the geo-employment state you are targeting. Additionally, if you are employed, you may also look for a job, what I call on-the-job search, but then you're only going to accept the offer if it gives you a higher value than your current one, which is the reason why the expected value term that you find in the option value is the maximum between the differential of the two values and 0, essentially. And finally, you may also look for a job remotely from rural to urban areas, in which case, not only the job needs to compensate you for your current welfare value, but it also needs to compensate you for the fixed monetary mobility cost that will be calibrated and that you will need to pay upon migrating. On the firm side, I'm going to assume that firms are pinned to a location and that they are heterogeneous in productivity. In this model, productivity is going to stand for technology differences across firms times a constant price level. Firms are going to choose whether or not to enter the market and in which sector to do so, conditional on their productivity. And importantly, they're going to produce with constant returns to scale using labor only as a factor of production. This means that my framework is set in the medium term, where capital allocation is implicitly deemed as sticky. And also the fact that firms produce with constant returns to scale will make the fact that I do not allow for formal jobs recruiting some workers informally being second order in the model, because the size of the firm itself will be second order for the total output in the model. Because workers are low skilled in the model, I assume that they have zero bargaining power, so that firms will post wages given existing matching conditions in equilibrium. And the difference between the formal and informal sector is that formal firms are going to pay taxes and severance when firing workers when operating in the formal sector. Importantly, I assume away minimum wages because there's no national minimum wage over my study period in South Africa. To be fair, there are some collective wage bargaining agreements, but I do not have precise enough information on the industry sector to include them in the model. And when they are informal, they are going to incur an expected monitoring cost, which will be increasing and convex in firm size. And that stands for, as I mentioned, the expected cost of being inspected and or fined. In rural areas, you see the profit function that firms are going to maximize. And this is the simplest form because I do not distinguish between formal and informal firms in rural areas. Profit is just going to be the productivity P minus the wage offered times the size of the firms. Those are all endogenous quantities, and you see that wages and firm sizes directly depend, conditional on equilibrium condition, on the welfare values from worker side. In cities, when operating in the formal sector, the production function is going to look the same, but the profit function of firms is going to incorporate a corporate tax rate small t and a payroll tax rate tau, plus the severance pay rate, which is going to be paid at rate delta when these firms are going to fire workers. Finally, in the informal sector, you see that those taxes disappear, but that an additional informality cost C that depends on firm size is added as a cost in the production function. I will skip the exact resolution of the model to comment a bit more on the equilibrium definition, to fix a bit in the ideas of what is endogenous in the model. So welfare distributions of workers, which should not be confused with the job offers from firms, are going to be endogenous, and I'm going to recover them from stationary conditions on the worker side. So importantly, I'm going to assume steady state on local employment shares, but because this country is still urbanizing, I will not assume steady state between rural and urban areas. Instead, I will calibrate a constant urban growth rate, which is consistent with the data because of very slow structural change. This urban growth rate barely moves within my 10-year period. But of course, this will correspond to a transitory outcome because over the very long term, you would expect this urban growth rate to slowly decrease until you reach a geographic steady state, which is not what I describe in my equilibrium outcomes. The employed and non-employed worker shares corresponding to the worker allocation are going to be recovered from the same stationary conditions. The rural amenities are going to be recovered from the special equilibrium condition I already mentioned. The value of leisure is going to be recovered from a reservation value condition that states that in equilibrium, the lower bound of values offered by firms is exactly equal to the local value of non-employment. Then you're going to recover value posting policies depending on productivity levels from the first optimality conditions, as well as firm sizes from steady state conditions on, more specifically, the flow of workers across each individual firm. I'm also going to recover firm shares, more specifically in cities, from a free entry condition and a profit indifferent condition on the productivity range where both types of firms coexist. And finally, I'm going to recover the parameters of the informality cost function, as well as the parameters of the ex-ante productivity distribution in which urban firms draw their productivities from the same equilibrium conditions. So there's a bunch of parameters that I'm going to calibrate, on which I will not give many details now, but I will give some more details on how estimation works more precisely. So I first, to close the model, the equilibrium that I just presented, I will need to estimate offer distributions and transition rates. And the way I'm going to do it is by operating a nested method of moments and by assuming that job offers follow beta distributions with the following parameters. And essentially, in the inner loop of the estimation, I will target the observed transition probability that are represented in the data part. Importantly, there's going to be an analytical relation between the model parameters and the theoretical counterparts for these transition probabilities, which is going to allow me to have the most precise fit possible on these targeted moments. And then in the outer loop, I'm going to target the observed wage quantiles from the distributions I also presented in the data part. And because there's no close-form relation between the model parameters and those distributions, I will have to solve this part of the estimation numerically, but I still find a good enough fit overall. I'll have to skip through the exact value of the parameters and the model fit to go to the second part of the estimation procedure, which will be a successive method of moments allowing me to recover firm shares on parameters of the informality cost function, which is going to have a standard span of control firm with a multiplicator CF and an elasticity term gamma F. And I'm also going to assume that the ex-ante urban productivity is going to follow a log normal law with parameter mu and sigma. And essentially, how it's going to work, first I'm going to consider active firms only, and I'm going to minimize the quadratic distance that captures the free entry and the profit in different conditions that I already mentioned. And additionally, to recover the share of inactive firms among potential entrants. This is important because in counterfactuals, some firms are going to exit. So I need to be able to recover this quantity in equilibrium. I will essentially target the truncation of the overall ex-ante productivity distribution on the observed active productivity range of firms. And because the share of inactive firms is exactly going to be equal to the lower bound of this cumulative distribution function over the active productivity range, this is going to allow me to recover the true values of firm shares and informality cost parameters in return. Now for the baseline results. So I'll skip the model fit to go directly to the rank ordering of welfare values. You see that importantly, urban formal, as you would expect, urban formal jobs come first, but then they're followed by urban informal jobs, which are valued more than rural employed jobs on average. And this is important because this is going to justify the move of rural workers into urban informality, even when incurring a wage cut on average, which is what I observed. Also, the value of rural non-employment is going to be slightly lower than the value of urban non-employment, and that's a direct consequence of the special equilibrium condition. When I look more precisely at the decomposition of welfare across the different components that are underlined in the Bellman equations, you see that I find positive rural amenities. I take no stance a priori on the sign of these amenities. So that means that workers in the data tend to favor more rural characteristics than urban characteristics, at least the ones that I mentioned. And importantly, it means that most of the migration motives are going to be captured by improved career prospects and not by better urban amenities.
Sorry, Thomas, you have 5 minutes.
Yeah, thank you. And also, I want you to remind that the stepping stone potential of informal jobs is going to be captured by this finding that I underlined in the introduction, that 20% of the welfare value of urban informal jobs will be captured by future formal job opportunities in cities. Now for the counterfactuals. I'm going to keep the transition rates, informality cost parameters, and value of leisure as exogenous. And I'm going to endogenize offer distribution, which are exogenous parameters at baseline. And the way I'm going to do so is by embedding the firm side in the worker side and targeting the baseline ex-ante productivity distribution that I presented, which is an endogenous outcome of the model. But because I assume a wage structural change, it's not supposed to change. And the policy shock, more precisely, that I will estimate, which correspond to typical policies adopted in developing countries, will consist in a progressive increase of the firm size elasticity cost parameter gamma from 1 to 1.3, which roughly corresponds to an increase of the mean informality cost from 13 to 36% of mean informality firm revenues before firms' behavior changes. For the sake of simplicity, I will only present the results. I will not present the results on the whole range, but just on the end range when I increase the value of the gamma parameter up to 1.3. And as I said, total output is going to rise at the expense of workers' welfare. And that's because workers will be reallocated toward more productive firms locally. Formal firms tend to be more productive than informal firms on average. And because of such frictions, now it's easier for workers to find a job in the formal sector. And this is going to push up overall output. But this will come at the cost of lower workers' welfare due to wage cuts, on which I will comment in a moment. And importantly, those aggregate figures hide substantial composition effects, because as you see in cities, as I said, welfare is going to decrease and output is going to increase, but the picture is not the same in rural areas. The reason why is that because the most productive rural firms are going to be able to outbid urban firms that cut wages, which is going to increase rural welfare, and also is going to reallocate rural workers from the least to the most productive firms, which is also going to improve rural output per worker. This means that special reallocation of workers from urban to rural areas in equilibrium will limit the global rise in output, but also limit the global fall in welfare. I commented already on the stepping stone mechanism. I want to add that the job formalization rate that I find strictly dominates the job destruction rate. And these answers on the worker side and the firm side are important because they will allow me to explain the mechanisms underlying point 3, which is why do cities become less attractive. I'll skip on the firm's distribution to go directly to the mechanism here. Because informal jobs are a stepping stone here, it means that they are a valuable outside option for workers, more so that in other contexts where information frictions from the informal to the formal sector are more important. And because the informal sector is mostly an avoidance strategy for firms, the formalization shock will translate into more competition in the formal sector and not merely by firm destruction. What this means is that in equilibrium, you are going to find more firms competing for more workers in the formal sector with fewer outside options. And the thing is, the added competition among firms is going to push wages up because firms need to compete for workers. But the fact that there are now more workers with fewer outside options is going to relax the matching conditions. And this is going to lower wages in equilibrium. And I find that this second effect will be dominant, which explains the wage cuts and consequentially the welfare cuts I observed in cities, and why finally potential rural migrants prefer to stay in rural areas and not to migrate into urban areas. So that the main figure that I would like you to remember from this study is that the urban population share falls by 4% in counterfactual. Finally, in this paper, I found that urban informality had an ambiguous role in spatial labor allocation. First, because it limits formal firms' local labor market power, which is positive. but also because it shelters low productivity firms from competition, which is negative. I add an additional effect, which is that by maintaining local wage level, urban informality also favors rural-urban migration, which has potential policy consequences that I will not have the time to discuss now, but maybe we can discuss during the time that we have left. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you so much for such a nice presentation. Very nice work, very interesting.
Thank you so much.
Now I will give the floor to Damian Organ, who will do a brief discussion of the paper, after which we will be open the floor for more questions of the panelists. So Damiano, the floor is yours. Thanks.
Thank you very much, and thank you very much for having me here to discuss the paper by Thomas Monnier. I'm going to share my slides. Okay, I'm doing it right. Yes, I guess. Okay, Thomas has a very ambitious job market paper, and it's called the Informality Trade-off, Wages and Rural-Urban Migration in South Africa. Sorry, let me put this at full screen. Okay. So the very general question in economics, and super important for many developing countries, basically, is an informal sector good or bad? And okay, this is translate to the question that Thomas addressed, that is, should we shrink an informal sector? And this is a policy that is normal to think about as having a very important general equilibrium effect. And so he builds a general equilibrium model that features both rural to urban migration decision, and then given that migrants decide to move to the city, they can choose between working in the formal or in the informal sector. Thanks to this model, it can study the general equilibrium effect of what he calls the formalization policy. Is a very clear and straightforward. Is going to increase the cost of being inspected. That is, if you are inspected and you work in an informal sector, you get a sanction that is much. Yeah. And his findings are that in the laboratory study that is South Africa, some informal firms are going to formalize, okay, and the wage in the formal sector are going to decrease, while wages in the rural sector are going to increase, and urban population is going to decrease. Let me say that he did a huge job both in modeling and calibrating the model, that as it's not trivial at all, the research is undergoing. And so I was very interested in reading his paper, and I look forward to see how it's going to develop. I'm going to put a bit aside all the good things that Thomas Monnier did in his paper for the sake of time, and let me give some main comments I want to a bit address to Thomas to make, at least for me, a bit clearer some things. I think that a work like the one of Thomas, a model without any closed form that is estimated out of steady states, is very difficult to pitch to an external audience. And in this essence, I would ask you now in a bit to be a bit clearer about the mechanism, because these are hard to follow because a lot of things are going around, but these are key because are your external validity. This is what we learn from your exercise. And in particular, I would like to know what are the results that kind of arise directly from your modeling choice versus what is really not so trivial and we wouldn't expect. And so we learn by your model, and I would like to see graphs depicting dynamics. And while the list of mechanisms at play is a bit hard to follow because there are so much, and the model is very, very rich. So you have this kind of trade-off between the fact that your model is very rich and to account for all the things that are going around. So I will ask you this question if you want to talk a bit about this. When we think about informal sector and you have those elements in your model, no? Standard economics theory would predict that you do have risk neutral agents, if I got it correctly. So there is no risk, no gain in unemployment benefit. There is no utility from taxation and redistribution, to my understanding. So taxes paid by the firm are not increasing the aggregate utility of your economy. So normally we would tend to think that adding a friction, so increasing cost for informal things, is going only to reduce welfare and output. And this is a well-known argument in favor of, let's say, informal sector. And if you can tell us why this is not the case and what you are adding to your model that are putting some interesting trade-off and are making these things not straightforward, and this is not the results in your paper, and instead we do have that output increase. And I think if you can argue a bit on this, it's going to make also to me clear and the importance of how you distribute market power, if it is the case in your economy. For what concern the empirical part, I know this is to put together unbiased estimate and macroeconomic model but I do think that you have kind of a way to estimate an unbiased estimation of your parameters, and you have this panel data, and you could add a selection into migration equation and the latent type model to have this the parameter that are unbiasedly estimates. And I think that I understand this is not it's tough, but it would I think that your paper and project would benefit a lot. For what concern minor comments, I will send you the slides, and I think it's better to go on the discussion. Thank you very much, Thomas, for your paper, and it was very enjoyable to read.
I mean, thank you for the discussion. That's always like super useful to have feedback. Just how much time do I have to answer?
A couple of minutes will be okay, then we can open the floor for the rest to ask questions.
Okay. Can you just please keep your slides on so that I take the questions one by one?
Oh. Okay, I guess. Let's.
So where should I start?
I think for me, for example, that I read the paper, I would like to ask you if you can have an answer on this. What do you have in your modeling on your paper?
I see. So your point about risk neutrality is perfectly right. It's just that I do not expect this to be first order in my model. Actually, there are other papers quantifying the insurance value of formal jobs and also the insurance value of urban versus rural jobs. This tends to be more important for seasonal migration compared to permanent migration. Because my focus is on long-term migration, I expect this to be second order. It's still not negligible. Typically, the insurance motive accounts for 20% of the value of informal jobs. This is why I'm not doing it right now, but I would like essentially, I mean, I'm not expecting this to make a huge difference. If anything, it would make formal jobs more valuable, which should go in the direction of my mechanism. But I can definitely add this insurance value as a lump sum transfer in the model. Just that incorporating full risk aversion makes the structure way more complex. For the duty gain from taxation, you're also right. So typically, that's the reason why I do those computations comparing welfare and output. I do have taxes in the model, and actually the increase in informality cost will also be accounted for as being added tax revenues from the government's perspective. But because I do not know anything and I'm not modeling the way it's redistributed, I just take the overall output to say, okay, so this policy has negative welfare consequences, but what are the recommendations in terms of policies? Either you decide to keep on with the policy, and then for it to be profitable, you need to do some redistribution, which the rise in output allows you to do. But you're right, I take no stance on how this should work. Like this is for another work, I guess. Or you go for another type of more indirect formalization policy, such as providing informal workers with alternative, such as public employment schemes, which have been shown to work as an alternative to informal jobs. And because they come with guaranteed wages, they do not have this negative impact on formal firms' labor market power. I do not really understand your point about adding a friction can only reduce welfare and output. Informality cost, I mean, as I said, informality is not, it's not clear whether it's a friction or not. Like on the one hand, it is because it protects low productivity firms from competition and the economy benefits from having less informal firms. But on the other hand, it reduces the market power that comes from frictions in my model in the formal sector. So, I mean, except if there's something I did not understand, I think that's the whole point of the paper, that the answer is not obvious a priori, and you need a model in order to do that. And, you know, like taxes are not necessarily like just frictions in this framework, to the best of my understanding. And I mean, I think the mechanisms are the ones that I just underlined. So, I mean, do you want to answer on this, or do you want me to go to next slide?
No, it's okay. Really, what I want to know is exactly because your result do not come from the risk aversion, do not come from the use of taxation. What are the drivers? And you answer me. I mean, this is interesting. The fact that the informal sector is going to protect low productive firms and is going to reduce the market power in the formal sector.
Exactly.
And this is really what, yes, this is what really about, to really understand the force driving your results, because you have so many mechanisms that sometimes it's difficult to focus on the more relevant one. No, it's okay.
Okay.
So if I will let to the other, if there are any additional questions.
I mean, you had other questions as well, no?
Yes, in the empirical part, but I mean maybe more than I don't know if you have thought about to have these unbiased estimates of your parameters of interest, if you have thought about how to estimate unbiased way your transition probability.
No, that's a great point, and actually you're right that so I discussed that in the paper, but I've not formatted the appendix yet. So it may. So typically that's what I mentioned already. I do those heterogeneity checks by recovering the moments from a multinomial logit model, accounting for observables, for instance, or fixed effects in the case of wedge distributions. I mean, you cannot incorporate fixed effects with the transition probabilities, because otherwise you identify the model only on movers. But I mean, I discussed, so typically, what I'm saying, the thing is, this model is kind of long to estimate. So to be fair, I did not estimate it with those different definitions of the moments. What I do for now is just assess by how much the values of the moments vary when I do those robustness checks. And even though I did not show them here, the difference does not seem to be like super substantial. But you're right that there could be a bias. Actually, in the paper, I argue more specifically that the bias only comes from potential heterogeneity within origin-destination pairs, because the constant part of selection across origin-destination pairs is going to be captured by the friction parameters that I estimate. And also, but I skipped through this part in this presentation, but I try to quantify the higher bound of this potential bias. And the way it enters in the model is in the value of in the option value of future urban formal job opportunities when in rural areas. And essentially, what I'm saying, so this value is equal to twice the option value from informal jobs. It's not possible that it's lower. So I'm saying like this is a higher bound, like the true value probably lies in between. In any case, because it accounts for like 1 or 2% of the total welfare value, this should not change substantially the stocks that I estimate in equilibrium, which are the main outcomes of interest to study global welfare and output. Because again, what you're considering here are average values for aggregate stocks, and it's not a model of individual welfare because there's no heterogeneity. And you're right, actually the thing is it's complex. The way it's usually done in the quantitative spatial literature is by adding idiosyncratic shocks, accounting for this unobserved heterogeneity within origin-destination pairs. But to be fair, to the best of my knowledge, the only dynamic search and matching model that does that is a recent working paper by Hayes and Porzio, And the thing is, the estimation becomes really complex when you're doing that. I mean, there are other possibilities. I mean, I did not cite this job market paper by Samuel Marshall, I mean, it's in my literature review. But I mean, they do it. It's just like their model is not dynamic, and it does not feature essentially unemployment risk, and frictions are not modeled in the same way. So I'm not saying like this is the right approach. I'm just saying to the best of I do not know many papers that do that basically because it's hard. But yeah, I mean that would be a venue for future work for sure.